All right, I think we are on and live. People are starting to come in and join. Welcome, everyone. Happy Thursday. Sort of coming to you from Furman and the lake behind me. I hope everybody's having a wonderful day. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. I'm excited for what the next hour holds. My name is Jane McBride. I'm class of 91, and I am the Assistant Director of Alumni and Parent Engagement. We are so thrilled to have Danielle and Jessica with us today. Wanting to let you know we're planning on about an hour today. We are going to allow time for question and answer at the end of their session. And if you would just throughout the session, just submit your questions via the chat box below. We will get to as many questions as possible, whether we're able to write a response to you or whether we are able to read your question out and talk about it towards the end. Want to remind everybody that we are right almost in the middle of Furman at Home, which is our virtual homecoming series, and it's going on all the way through next week. So make sure you check out online the activities and options and drop-ins that we have available for you. There are a lot to choose from, and unfortunately, since we can't be together right now, my counterpart Sarah has done a fantastic job putting this virtual homecoming together. So I hope you're going to be able to take advantage of that. So without further ado, I'm actually going to turn it over to Danielle and allow her to introduce herself and move forward the program. Thank you everybody for being here.
Thanks, Jane. I am Danielle Vinson. I am class of 89, and I'm also a professor of politics and international affairs at Furman. And today we're going to be talking about election 2020. Let me get my screen shared up here so you can see it. Let me rearrange a little bit. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We've seen protests going on much of the summer and even into the fall in our country. We have a Supreme Court vacancy that's likely to be filled in the very near future before Election Day. We've had wildfires out west. We've had hurricanes along the Gulf Coast. We have concerns about whether our mail is moving at the right pace or not in the wake of an upcoming election with an avalanche of absentee ballots expected. And it's enough to make us all want to go hide in the corner. But we've got an election right around the corner. And today, Jessica and I are going to try to help you figure out what will ultimately matter in deciding this election and how you can help make sense of it as you're watching things unfold over the next few weeks. I am eliciting the help of the animals at the National Zoo in these slides. This is a moment I need to say these photos were taken around 2008 or 2010. Any resemblance they may bear to actual candidates is purely coincidental. I have not doctored the photos, and you'll know what I mean when you see it eventually in the presentation. So let's look at what ultimately will happen in 2020. In political science, we often look at the sort of structural factors that underlie an election. That's things like what the party registration is in a particular state and which direction a state typically leans. Those things are sort of baked into our election context. But there are three other things that tend to vary quite a bit from one election to the next that political scientists focus on. And so we want to look at those three factors today as they relate to the 2020 election. Those factors are the candidates themselves, the issues that are salient or important to voters in that particular election year, and the national mood, the sort of mood of the country. What direction do we think the country's going in? Do we like the direction it's going in or not? In 2016, the presidential election was primarily about the two candidates, and particularly for many of the voters, which one was least objectionable. We saw both of those candidates, Trump and Clinton, had record unfavorable ratings in polls throughout that election cycle. And ultimately, We saw a lot of undecided voters throughout the election trying to figure out which candidate they could live with and how those candidates would affect a range of issues, not just one particular issue. The economy probably stood out. There were a whole range of issues that people were concerned about in 2016. And there were groups that were particularly concerned about the impact the candidates would have on the courts. National mood in 2016 also wasn't particularly good. But ultimately, it sort of came down to which one of these people can you tolerate, Clinton or Trump? 2020 is a little different. In 2020, it's all about Trump. And at this point, there aren't a lot of folks left sitting on the fence. So let's take a look at how the issues are playing out and how they relate particularly to the president. One of the things that I found interesting is that so much of the issues this year, how people are thinking about them, are really tied directly to the president and how he has uh, dealt with the issues and also how he's framed the issues or how he's characterized the issues. So, for example, one of the issues that's going to be particularly important is the pandemic. But we see the president often setting up this sort of decision or contrast between do we give in to the pandemic and shut everything down, or do we stay open and try to keep the economy going? And so he's kind of cast this as a choice of one or the other. What we're finding with key voters, though, is his supporters definitely appreciate his focus on the economy. Let's keep it open. But some folks, clearly those on the left, are worried about the pandemic and whether the president has taken it seriously enough. Couple of interesting groups of voters, though, on this issue to keep an eye on are going to be suburban women who have at times voted Republican in the past, and elderly people who have voted Republican in larger numbers in the last election. Both of those groups have been profoundly influenced and affected by the pandemic. It's affected their lives very directly. And we're starting to see some evidence that they're not particularly happy with how the president has handled that issue. And so watching those voters as we get up to election day will be important for helping us figure out which way this election goes. Second issue that's been important is the racial justice issue that was raised in the wake of the George Floyd death in Minnesota and the protests that have followed that all summer long and into the fall. We've seen the president at times seem a little bit uncomfortable dealing directly with the racial justice aspects of these protests. And instead, he's focused more on the law and order side of things, supporting the police, worrying about the violence that's occurred in some of the protests. And his supporters clearly like that focus on law and order. But for a lot of minority voters and younger voters, the racial justice issues have really resonated this summer. They have continued those protests in ways that we've not seen on a lot of issues in recent years. And the question we're going to have going into the election is, are they going to translate that mobilization to protest into mobilization to actually vote? If you see larger numbers of younger voters showing up to vote this time, if you see larger numbers of minority voters showing up to vote this time compared to 2016, that is likely not going to be very good for the president. Finally, I want to look at the issue of healthcare really briefly. The healthcare has become salient for two reasons. One, clearly the pandemic puts that on everybody's minds. Folks have had to make decisions about can they afford to go get tested for coronavirus, or what happens if they do test positive and they need treatment for coronavirus. How good is their healthcare? Can they afford it? You've also got the concerns right now that this next Supreme Court appointment will be affecting the court's ruling on the Affordable Care Act sometime during the year. And so those who have benefited from the Affordable Care Act are particularly concerned about the healthcare issue in this election. You'll notice as I've talked about these three issues, I haven't mentioned Joe Biden. And that's because weirdly in this election, it's not clear that Biden's positions on these issues matters all that much to voters. They seem to be more concerned about whether they like Trump's position on the issues and what he's done. If they don't like Trump's position on the issues or what he's done, they tend to be looking for someone who will do something different. And they're pretty sure Biden will be different. So his specific position on the issues seems less relevant than that has been in past elections where we've cared about both candidates on the issues. Um, let's look at the candidates themselves. How you characterize these candidates right now tells you a lot about where you think your vote's going in this election. Trump's supporters find him confident. They like his fighting attitude. They like that he has clearly shaken up the political establishment over the last 4 years. And they see that as a positive. But we are seeing evidence that some voters who supported Trump in 2016 have found this approach to politics a bit more chaotic. And they are not particularly thrilled with the chaos and the bombast that the president brings to his job. And so they're looking for an alternative. Again, I'm not sure it mattered all that much who the Democrats chose. But in Biden, they get a candidate who's relatively boring, at least compared to Trump. Yes, he takes a nostalgic turn from time to time. That doesn't always play well with their younger voters, but he does know policy. And very importantly, he does not tweet. And for many voters this year, that actually may be enough. They like that contrast. Biden's choice of Harris as a running mate, I think, also has been helpful to him with some of those voters that may not have cared too much for him personally. Minority voters, women particularly, seem to be pleased with the choice of Harris. She brings a different kind of energy to the ticket that I think younger voters have found appealing. And so that has probably been somewhat beneficial to Biden. But again, I think what matters more is whether people like how Trump has behaved or not. You'll notice that this election, too, I think Mike Pence is largely irrelevant. In 2016, he was important in sending a message to evangelicals and the Christian right that there was someone supporting them in the White House. But this time around, that seems less important. And so ultimately, we come back to the president himself. Finally, let's take a look at the national mood. It's not so good. We see a lot right now of fear and anger among voters, and interestingly, among voters on both sides. For each side, there is a fear about what the other side will do if they win election. For those on the left, there is concern about what 4 more years of Trump sort of blowing apart our political norms, what that will ultimately do to our system of government, and also his sort of tendency to focus more on his supporters and his base at the exclusion of others, that willingness to continue to divide and not spend as much time trying to unite. There's concern about what that does to the division in the country. On the conservative side of things, on the Republican side, there's fear of what a Joe Biden presidency might look like, not so much because of Biden himself, but because of how amenable he might be to the progressive wing of the party, pulling him more in that direction. And so you see a lot of concerns about what that might look like. There's also a fair amount of anger in our electorate right now. We've seen that in the protests this summer. We've seen that in the counter protests more recently. We've got sides literally clashing in the streets right now. And that anger fuels a lot of concerns. Fear and anger are really good motivators. They get us to do things. When we're happy with the way the country is going, it's easy to decide we don't have time to vote. Or that it doesn't matter as much who we vote for. When the world is peaceful, voting seems to be less of a priority. But fear and anger motivate people to turn out. And this time around, we're expecting really high turnout. We're already seeing record early voting and absentee voting in a number of states. And with that come the concerns about how we manage that record turnout, How do we count those votes? And again, this ties back to the president. He has spent 4 years worrying about, very vocally about voter fraud. And as a result, you've seen a number of states trying to put in place measures that might deal with voter fraud, but that also have a tendency to make it more challenging to vote. And so one of the questions we're going to have to look at is, in this high voter turnout scenario, and particularly with early or record absentee and mail-in voting, how many of those votes actually get counted? Are there signatures missing that will disqualify some of them? If it happens occasionally here or there, that's not a problem. But if it starts happening in any significant way in key states that turn out to be swing states, that begins to have an effect on the actual outcome of the election. And so that one we may not know until we actually start counting votes and see what happens on election night. But those are all things that we'll be looking for. And I hope those give you a framework to sort of to make sense of what's going on, and to help you kind of think through what this might mean for the outcome on election day. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Jessica, who will now wow you with the data. Jess? Jessica, unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think you need to stop sharing your screen and then I can put
There we go.
All right. Here we go. Yes, so as Dr. Vinson was explaining, this is a choice election that we really see it as. And I think that President Trump, while in 2008, he was the change. And now 4 years later, I think we have a lot of people that don't like the change that happened. And we've had a lot of people become more motivated and more engaged. And when talking to when talking to the levels of voter turnout, there's certainly a lot of conversations right now about, well, this record turnout has to be good news for Democrats, and this means a blowout. I would just caution that that's not necessarily true. Certainly, we see the early vote as we see in polling that Democrats overwhelmingly say that they are going to vote early, that they are going to vote by mail, and then Republicans, largely motivated by this, unsubstantiated fear that Trump has stoked about absentee voting, and tend to vote on election day. So we could also see, very big lines and backups on election day too. But right now we estimate that turnout could be, a few months ago, we were even saying 140 million, 150 million. I think it could go as high as 155 or even 160 million, which that would be the highest percentage of registered voters that we have seen since 1900. But, for all of this, it has really been a very stable race. When we look back here, so this is the most recent 538 polling average, which is one of the ones that we like to look at, because I think that they weight their polls and average higher quality polls. So this is the one that we are looking at to sort of see where things are. As of today, Biden has almost a 10-point lead. It was a little higher even a few days ago. And, sort of in September, it's been pretty steady around sort of a 7, 8, 9-point lead. We did see with the first debate a really big drop for the president, where there was a 10, 12, 14, 16-point lead in some of the national live caller polls that we at the Cook Political Report trust the most. And that really affected down ballot races too, as I will explain. So you can see this sort of trend line here in October here that increased for Biden. But you go back here to where the pandemic started, Biden, even right as he was getting the Democratic nomination, still had a lead. And then we've seen some things drop with President Trump as he mishandled the pandemic response, voters increasingly see. And so what we have seen is a very steady race. And one of the things we hear a lot is that, of course, well, the polling was wrong in 2016, so how can we really trust it now? But the national polling actually got that about right. But the problem was that we didn't have enough high quality state polling to sort of see the shifts that were happening in Michigan and Wisconsin and sort of those Rust Belt states. Now we have sort of an overabundance of the polling, and it's been pretty steady. And I'll show you some of that here in a little bit. But also, Clinton here in the polling, she never broke 50%. She was sort of there in the mired in sort of the mid to high 40s. And she ended up getting 48% of the vote, really. So it wasn't that far off. But of course, we also didn't really see until 2016 the way that the votes had been allocated, really, that she, again, overperformed in Texas and New York and made up more of those votes. And that we could see that, again, Republicans have allocated their voters more efficiently, really, than Democrats have. And so that's why I think that about a 4-point Biden national lead, if he wins the popular vote by about 4 points, we think that that's enough to offset any of that would sort of be the level of where he could at least win the Electoral College. But anything below that sort of, it gets a little bit dicey. And you can see here his trend has been upward from where Clinton was, and he's now polling consistently above 52%. And then where we have seen Trump, though, is since he was elected, he has not expanded his base. He has not really made any effort to reach out to independents. He continues in his rallies and different things that he does to sort of gin up the base. And those voters are going to be with him no matter what. There's about 44% of voters that, again, no matter what he does, no matter what he says, are going to be with him. But that's not enough right now to sort of win election when we look at the demographic shifts in the country. And as Dr. Vinson was also talking about, I think the two key groups to look at this year are seniors and women and suburban voters. The most recent Fox News national poll that came out had Biden leading by 10. But when we break it down into the subgroups, among women, Biden was leading by 19. In the exit polls in 2016, Clinton won women by 13 points. I think we're going to see a record gender gap. That was in 2016, that was the highest that we had seen since 1996. But I think it's going to be 19, 20 points perhaps, which again would be just a record gender gap that we haven't seen before. And then seniors here, incredibly key. Voters over 65, Trump won them by 7 points in 2016. In Fox News poll, he was just leading them by 2. And in other polls, I've seen higher leads than that. Turns out that if you are the most vulnerable to a virus and you're worrying about it, and that you see a president largely not taking it seriously, and if you are not able to hug your grandchildren or go about regular life, that doesn't make you very amenable to what the White House is doing or what the White House is saying when they continue to question the efficacy of masks. And I also think Trump had a real opportunity after he was diagnosed with COVID to come out and say, listen, I got the best healthcare that anyone in the world could get. I realize now what some of these people are going through, to show empathy. Would that have won the election for him? I'm not sure that it would have, but it could have stopped the bleeding in some of these down ballot races, certainly, and could have perhaps helped with this demographic here. But he comes out, he takes off his masks when he still could be contagious. He's not answering direct questions about when his last test was and different things, continues to hold these rallies while they may be outdoor. They are not masked. They are, right close in with each other. When I look at them, I mean, I don't know about you all, but after the past few months, I just look at people in close quarters and it just, sort of gives me the heebie-jeebies given everything that we know about the virus. So I think that's another big shift. And then also here, white women with college degrees. Clinton won them by 7. Biden is winning them by 18 points. So that's a really big shift that we are seeing. And it's those women here, if we look down into suburban women, these are the big shifts that we saw in 2018 that enabled Democrats to flip the House. And now we're seeing it in the presidential race and then in Senate races too, that I'll talk about in just a minute. Suburban women, Biden winning them by 20. But Trump actually won those voters by 4. And then you also see here white women without a college degree and also white non-college voters in general. While Trump is still winning them, he's not winning them by the same margin that he was 4 years ago. And so that was sort of his base of voters. And Biden has been able to shrink that margin. Again, I think some of them look at the economic effects and they're not sort of getting what they're promised. You have a lot of white non-college women too that are pro-choice, that look at sort of, they're struggling with their kids at home and maybe working multiple jobs and different things. And so Biden has really been able to tighten that gap. And again, as Dr. Vinson said, I'm not sure that it's as much about what Joe Biden says he will do, but it's sort of more about what President Trump has done. Oh, I don't know what that is. All right, well, I had another in here, but I'll just show you the seniors, at least, were in the most recent Fox News polls that we got last night, had Biden. You can just see where Biden is with seniors in Michigan, of course, a very crucial state, up 13, Wisconsin up 14. In those states as well, I can just tell you that he was leading women by double digits, suburban women by double digits in those other states. And those are sort of among the four most crucial states to his path to victory. And we have a really cool tool on our site that I encourage you to check out at cookpolitical.com. And this is our demographic swingometer. We look for, demographics are destiny in any election is what we are learning. If we look at just the demographic shifts that has happened in the country since 2016, and we apply those same turnout levels, Biden right now would be winning by 307 electoral votes. So he would have the presidency. And you can play around with, do you think that more white college graduates are going to turn out? What percentage do you think that they are going to vote for Biden or Trump? You can sort of play around with that. And that's a really cool tool that we have that, again, factors into each state and how many of those voters we have seen. That one didn't show up either, but I can tell you that if we looked at the current polling, Biden at this point, and we factor in those same numbers, that Biden would be winning by over 400 votes. Now, I'm not sure that that's going to happen, but that's sort of where how bad the shifts have been for them. And then we also see that Trump's main his best place where he was with voters for a long time was on the economy, that he could point to. Okay, even if you may not like what he's tweeting, you may not like what he's saying, you may not sort of like how he's approached this presidency, you still liked your 401k or your own pocketbook and things too. But that lead has also evaporated. So this is from the most recent Pew survey, and Trump only now has a 1-point edge on the economy over Biden. And then the larger gaps that we see down here that I think is what most voters are making their decisions on here. Look at how who would best handle the coronavirus outbreak. Biden 57, Trump 41, a 17-point difference. On who would bring the country closer together, Biden has a 20-point edge there. And even on law and order that Trump is pushing so much, Biden still wins that by 4 points. And then another sort of standard that we look to tell us if a president is going to win re-election as to where their approval ratings are. We look at Gallup that has been testing this back since post-World War II. And Trump is the only president in modern history to never have reached a 50% approval rating in the Gallup poll. He's hit 49% once, and that's it. And you can see again where all of these other presidents were at this point, right, but in their final poll before their election. This quadrant up here, Eisenhower, Reagan, Nixon, Clinton, Obama, and George W. Bush all had mostly over 50% approval. Bush was at 48. Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush down here, which are the only two modern presidents to lose re-election for a second term, down here in the 30s. I think with where our polarized environment is, again, that you do have that sort of 42, 44% of that still vote for Trump. Trump down here is at 46. And I think that, again, that sort of tells you he's down here with these presidents that have lost re-election largely. And then when we look to sort of how Trump is able to, or how Biden rather is able to get to the electoral votes, this is sort of our string of pearls model that we use that sort of illustrates where things are. And in our races that we rate as lean Democrat, that puts Biden over the edge. He's at 270 with Wisconsin at the tipping point. So really, Trump would have to win all of the races that we rate as toss-ups: Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Ohio, and Iowa, which I think are probably more doable. But he won Ohio by 8 points 4 years ago. He won Iowa by 9 points. The fact that these states are competitive, the fact that Texas is competitive, and also the Trump campaign is really out of money right now, which is really outstanding because they had such a massive war chest in the spring. I think really spent it and blew it early on things like Super Bowl ads. And there's certainly some questions about the management that his former campaign manager that has since been arrested did. But they're having to pull ads. They're being vastly outspent by the Biden campaign, which again, back in March was raising no money and sort of looked like, the scrappy outsider that it looked like, how are they going to be able to put together a campaign? I mean, they're well over $100 million cash on hand advantage right now. But again, it's all of these states here that Trump has got to win: Arizona, Wisconsin, that he won before. And I think, again, some of the harder ones remain someplace like Florida. We talk about, we may not know on election night who wins, but the states that I would look to are Florida and North Carolina, that I think we will see some of the early vote being able to be reported and counted. Florida especially, which again, I find incredibly ironic given the 2000 election. Florida's gotten its act together, I will say. They now have quick ballot counting. They are able to count the absentee ballots before election day. So we expect that we could actually have pretty quick results on that. And I don't see a path at all for Trump to the presidency unless he wins Florida again. So if you see a call on that with Biden pretty early, I think that tells you what you need to know about the presidential election, even if we may not know some of these other states and what kind of night it is going to be. North Carolina, we also expect them to perhaps report quite a bit of their early ballots on election night too. And this is just a different way to visualize that same thing. If you kind of look at it in jars, Biden's jar is overflowing with electoral votes. Trump, he still has quite a few that he needs to put in here. And then our toss-up states, and again, those toss-up states still wouldn't be enough to get him to 270 unless he picks off some of those marbles in Joe Biden's. And then let me talk about the Senate, which is my specialty at the Cook Political Report. I think we are increasingly headed for unified Democratic control, and that's a really important thing to think about when we look at what a Biden administration may be able to accomplish, whether it be on healthcare. I mean, Republicans certainly sort of raise the specter of that as they would pack the courts, they would abolish the filibuster, and I think that could be determinative by how many seats Democrats pick up. But at this point, I think that they are the clear favorite to win back the Senate. But I would say this is the last firewall really that Republicans have. And that's why you're seeing a lot of outside money from super PACs sort of rush to save these Senate seats. And so I would sort of rank the likelihood when we look at it that Democrats are going to hold the House after winning it last cycle. And in fact, we currently project that Democrats could pick up between 5 and 15 seats, which was really unheard of even a year ago, that after flipping 40 seats, the fact that there would still be seats for them to pick up really shows you how there has continued to be an erosion in the suburbs. So while Democrats lost seats last time in the Dallas suburbs and the Houston suburbs and Kansas City, Charleston, that those seats now look very safe. And now they are having to worry about sort of not as urbanized suburbs like Indianapolis, like St. Louis. So there are races that have really come on board that have Republicans spending a lot on defense where they did not expect to. And the same is true for the Senate. While Republicans started out with a tougher map, defending 23 seats to just 12 for Democrats, which is virtually the reverse of what happened in 2018. So while Republicans were able to net 2 seats in 2018, which again sort of ran counter to the to the larger climate that we saw in the larger wave, it was because Democrats were the ones defending far more seats than Republicans were, and they were defending seats in very, very red places where Democrats were, and they lost seats in Missouri and North Dakota and Indiana. But Democrats were then able to flip seats in Arizona and Nevada, which sort of portends for the larger shifts that we see, not in the Rust Belt area, but in the Sun Belt, that is increasingly becoming the most ripe areas for Democrats. So these are my ratings at the beginning of the year, and you can see a lot of red if you look to this map to the left. But the one on the right is where we are now. You see a lot more gray, you see a lot more blue or light red. I have moved 10 seats in Republicans and Democrats' direction over the past 10 months, and just 2 toward Democrats. And so this is where the map stands right now. You have these races all over here in sort of the Sun Belt area that are far more competitive. So, again, we had Colorado and Arizona and toss up at the beginning. Those are the two seats that Democrats are most favored to pick up. Texas now somewhat in play, Kansas, Georgia very much in play, North Carolina very much in play, and surprise, surprise, South Carolina is as well. And so again, you can just see here how many seats Democrats are, or Republicans rather, are defending, and they really have not decreased that competitive map. And if anything, it is far expanded from where we saw in July. And just the sheer fact that you have Republicans spending heavily in places like Kansas, in South Carolina, in Georgia, in Alaska. This should be pretty reliably red states. Georgia perhaps less so, given the demographic shifts that we've seen. Really tells you about what kind of a year it's shaping up to be. And really, there's only two offensive opportunities for Republicans. I think that they're going to lose the Alabama seat. And when I'm factoring in my calculation, I include that as a likely loss for Democrats. And then Gary Peters, still a lean D seat there, but I think that still a bit of a climb, especially when, Trump yesterday, there was again, that Fox News poll showed Biden up by 12 points in Michigan, which I think is a little high, but we've seen a pretty consistent high single digit lead for Biden in Michigan. And that's just a little bit too much, I think, for a Republican challenger to overcome. So Democrats need to flip 3 net seats to get to a 50-50 split, which, assuming a Biden presidency, then based on the polls, would mean that Vice President Kamala Harris would be the tiebreaker. You count that Alabama loss. Now they need 4 seats. And those 4 seats are very gettable. So you have Arizona here and Colorado, which again, we rate as lean Democrat, and I consider those losses. I think the next likely one to go is Maine, probably followed by the tipping point states, I think, are North Carolina and Iowa. That would get them to 5 seats. And so I think even, a 51-49 margin could possibly be the best that Republicans could hope for, a 51-49 margin for Democrats to hold them to. But I think it could go as high as 53, 55, 56, even if it's a really bad political night that we see. And a lot of that is being propelled by the money that we see. It's, Republicans bemoaned the green wave that happened in House elections in 2018. We are now sort of seeing a green tsunami in these Senate elections that you can see. This is the third quarter fundraising. So from the beginning of July to the end of September, and Democrats in our competitive races raised over $328 million to just 134 for Republicans. On average, Democrats outraised their Republican opponents by about $13.8 million. And, again, the number that sticks out here is the one in South Carolina, where Jamie Harrison not just broke, but obliterated the record of fundraising raised in one quarter that was previously at $38 million set by Beto O'Rourke in 2018, and he raised almost $58 million. I remember when, their campaign was telling me sort of where it was going to be, and I was just, I guessed 45, 50 based on some of the things that were coming in. And $57 million in a state like South Carolina is just truly astounding. And that's why I think you see, Lindsey Graham going on Fox News begging for money. His, 28 million is nothing to sneeze at during a normal election. That would be a very good haul, but again, not what you need. And there's a massive cash on hand advantage as we head into the final weeks of the race too. 122 million in the bank for Democrats and about 89 million for Republicans. And what we have seen there is Democrats vastly outspending Republicans on the airwaves. North Carolina and Iowa are seeing the most ad time. So if you are in one of those 2 states, I greatly feel for you. But if you're there in South Carolina, I feel for you too, because I don't know how many Jamie Harrison ads you're seeing a day, but it has to be a lot. I know one friend that was down there said that, they're like, elementary schooler could recite the ads by now. And but Republicans are coming in there to really sort of save Lindsey Graham. It's a super PAC, that's a Senate Leadership Fund that's tied to Mitch McConnell, that has really come in there and is now actually in this current week outspending Harrison. So, some people saying, well, how can he spend $57 million? He needs that money. He does, to sort of even the playing field. And I'll talk more about that race in just a little bit, but you can again see just where how much these races are seeing. I mean, Maine, even for a state as small as Maine, I don't think that you can see it's all political ads that you see right now. Montana, Democrats vastly outspending there in that Senate race. And again, that one Republican ad buyer told me yesterday, like, there is no more TV to buy in Montana. There just isn't. So here you can see the toss-up states in a better way of where Trump won them or lost them in 2016 versus to where the current Real Clear Politics polling average shows. Let me just start with, again, I think Maine, Susan Collins, she's been sort of the moderate senator. She's the last New England Republican. And I think that she's going to lose because she, more than anyone, I think sort of typifies how in the age of Trump, centrists are really stuck between a rock and a hard place, that you can't upset the conservative base, that you can't upset those Trump loyalists, or you're going to lose them. But then in doing so, you lose independents, you lose the conservative Democrats that she often had as part of her coalition. She's been in the Senate for 24 years. She's never had this tough of a race, and she's been able to sort of ride that center line. But what this increased polarization does, it also loses those senators in the middle, because those are the ones most likely to be defeated. So again, when we saw defeats last time by people like Joe Donnelly, Heidi Heitkamp, that were sort of in that moderate camp, you're going to have people on the most extremes increasingly, and that leads to further polarization. And so I think that House Speaker Sarah Gideon there has been leading or tied with her. Maine also has ranked choice voting, though. So I think that's ultimately what sort of does Susan Collins in. So when you use that, which more states are kind of looking at and considering to try to get to 50, I think that is Collins's problem. I still think North Carolina is the tipping point state, despite everything that has gone on there. You've probably read about the sexting scandal with Cal Cunningham. Not what you want in October, but we're not seeing it move the numbers that much. We're seeing a slight tightening, but I think, again, even Republicans I talk to, I think that they still think that Cunningham has the edge here. Tom Tillis is just very unpopular. They've succeeded in driving up Cunningham's negatives because, again, millions of dollars are being spent telling people about his affair and questioning whether there are more women. And he's been very evasive on the subject, sort of not holding campaign events and hiding. But again, you can do that during the age of COVID because a lot of candidates aren't doing the traditional campaigning, or at least ones that want to, protect people's safety. So I still think that's perhaps a loss. And then I think Iowa is the next one. Joni Ernst, while she was sort of a star of 2014, went to Washington. People there in Iowa sort of feel like she's sort of forgotten people back home, hasn't come home enough. Her negatives have really gone up. And, a lot of people sort of see, there was a debate moment last week where she was asked the price of soybeans and didn't know that. I don't know the price of soybeans, but I also don't live in Iowa and represent Iowa. So that's a very Iowa question, that if you're the senator that you should know. And Teresa Greenfield, her challenger, did know the price of corn. I think from there, I would look at perhaps Montana as the next one. While this shows, this one is only competitive because Democrats were able to get the popular term limited governor there, Steve Bullock, to run. The only thing that I can guarantee you in Montana right now is that the next senator is going to be named Steve. You have Steve Daines versus Steve Bullock, and Daines in the public polling has about a 3-point lead, but I think both Republicans and Democrats expect this to be a very close race, margin of error. While Trump won it by 20 points, this is another place where, I've seen him polling 6, 7, 8 lead. And that's somewhere where Bullock, who has been on the ballot with Trump before, could outperform him. Then you have the 2 races in Georgia, and Georgia is very unique and frustrating this cycle. The regular election is between David Perdue and Democrat Jon Ossoff. Very close race there. Perdue is leading by just about a point in the averages, but again, a very close race. And if no candidate gets 50%, because there is a libertarian on the ballot, which is possible, it would go to a January 5th, 2021 runoff. That would mean that there would be 2 races not decided until January 5th, because the special election where Kelly Loeffler was appointed to the seat, also would happen on January 5th. And she was appointed to appeal to, again, moderates and suburban women that they realized that they were losing very rapidly in the suburbs. She's a very wealthy businesswoman from Buckhead. And Doug Collins got in the race, who is, a House Freedom Caucus, Trump ally, and had to pull her to the right. She's had to sort of defend her conservative bona fides, stress her alignment with Trump. She's run a series of very bizarre ads where she says she's more conservative than Attila the Hun, which I wasn't aware of as a comparison that people usually make. But there's been not one, not two, but three ads where she's used that, including within Attila the Hun impersonator. And that's a problem for her if she needs. I think she will still get one of the runoff slots, but she only has 2 months to try to appeal to, again, a very rapidly changing Atlanta suburbs, diversifying, increasingly college educated voters. And the Democrat there is Raphael Warnock, who is pastor of the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, which was Martin Luther King Jr.'s church. And Democrats really hope that he can sort of energize Black voters. But I think those are going to be 2 runoffs in Georgia, so we won't know those races for a while. And are those the 2 races that determine control of the Senate, or does it determine how large Democrats' margin may be? And then I'll talk about South Carolina, and then I want to take your questions. No race surprised me more this cycle than this race. It started out in solid Republican. I interviewed Jamie Harrison when I was down in South Carolina covering the presidential primary, which I feel like was the last normal week of my life before COVID hit. And, at that point, we had it in solid Republican. I moved it to likely in either April or May. And we've just seen this increasingly tighten. No senator, I don't think, has undergone a bigger transformation over the past 4 years than Lindsey Graham. I also write for the Almanac of American Politics, and I had to rewrite his profile in this past edition. And I had to it started off, Lindsey Graham is one of the mavericks of the Senate, and I just had to completely rewrite this. He, in 2016, called Trump a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot and said, if we elect this man, we're going to get obliterated and we'll deserve to lose. Well, that may happen to Lindsey Graham this cycle. His conversion is sort of road to Damascus moment. I think conservatives don't really fully trust. And then you have a lot of independents and conservative Democrats that have voted for him in the past because, hey, it's probably the best we can do. He works across the aisle. He's not seen as, an uber conservative. Now they have an actual, very good candidate to run in Jamie Harrison. But apart from just raising money, I think he's speaking to the middle. His ads have been specifically targeted at winning over white suburban women. Every single week almost, they have another sort of older white woman who talks about how they voted for Lindsey Graham in the past, but he's changed. Healthcare is a message. I mean, healthcare is the undercurrent of a lot of these races on protecting pre-existing conditions, and Obamacare that has become increasingly popular with voters since 2010. It's hard, though, in South Carolina to get above 47 or 48% if you're a Democrat. It just is. And so that's why we see Harrison now with that $57 million running ads, trying to boost the third party candidate on the ballot, Bill Bledsoe, Constitution Party candidate, who, although he has dropped out and endorsed Graham, remains on the ballot. If Bledsoe can get 4% of the vote, that would come from Graham, presumably, and could hold him down. Again, the polls in this race are just tight. I think Republicans are feeling slightly better about it. They think that the Coney Barrett hearings helped Graham last week, but I think that, again, that tape where he talked about, hold the tape, I won't confirm a justice in the last year of a president's term, really kind of hurt him. And I think, again, just hammered home how much he has changed. So, and I will just say, with these toss-up races, we see them typically breaking the same way. So that's where I think we could sort of see a wave happen. Again, Democrats really only need 2 of these toss-ups to go, but around 70 to 80% of these races in our toss-up races, when we look back historically, have broken the same way, and it's been the same way of which side is sort of getting the wave and getting the momentum. And in 2016, every single Senate race voted the same way that the presidential race did. We see these elections, it's increasingly parliamentary, fewer and fewer ticket splitters. In fact, Pew did a study where since 2012, 122 of 139 Senate races have gone the same way the presidential races did in their states. And we see, again, decreased overperformance. It wasn't that uncommon, in the 1980 to 84 that we would have Republicans outrunning candidates by 15 points. That happened in 1992. In 1980, Democrats outran Carter by 13 points. In 84, they outran Mondale by 23 points. But we just don't see that happening anymore. It's 2 points was the average in 2016. Democrats can often do this a little bit better, but I think these races are going to sort of hew pretty closely to where the presidential races do.
All right, we've got lots of questions. So I'm going to start with the one I like. Since Jessica was talking, I can decide which one to start with, and you can peruse them while I'm talking, Jessica, and figure out which ones you want to take next. We've gotten a couple about the Graham race, and since you were ending with that, I'll pick up on that. Somebody wanted to know if I would offer a prediction. I am from the state of South Carolina, and as one of my former students who's on this video commented in the chat, I have often explained things in South Carolina with, well, it's South Carolina. And the one of the interesting questions that's been posed to me, not just in this chat, but by some reporters, is if Trump's leading the state by as much as we think he's leading the state by based on polls, how in the world is Lindsey Graham in a too close to call race? Who are those people that support Trump that won't vote for Graham? And I'm still looking for those people. I actually want to meet one of them in person. So if you know any of them, please send them my way. But I think one of the reasons that we still think this may be a more competitive race is there are some folks for which when Graham kind of let Trump slide on his negative comments toward John McCain, it surprised me how badly that played with some voters in South Carolina who've traditionally been Republican and supported Graham. Some of our military voters did not take well to that. And so they may be looking for an alternative or sitting that race out, so to speak. I think the other thing that Harrison has done that we're not well equipped to kind of figure out what that looks like on election day in South Carolina is he's given Democrats a reason to actually hold some hope they could win a race. Part of that's the fundraising advantage that let him start early. But let's face it, in South Carolina, we don't typically have competitive statewide races in November. Those are usually fought in a Republican primary in June. And so I think trying to figure out how that Democratic turnout might actually look when they've got a reason to go to the polls is why we still think this might be competitive. You've got younger voters that haven't traditionally shown up in large numbers that are showing interest this time around, and their interest is leaning more toward Harrison than Graham. So even though this is still South Carolina, and I will not believe that a Democrat wins statewide office until I wake up the day after the election and it has been officially declared, I do think that it's more competitive than maybe we would have ever expected under normal circumstances.
I'll just add to that. Yeah, I mean, I moved it. It made a lot of headway when I moved it. But again, I've talked to so many people down there. I joke that I kind of have a small focus group of people, unlike perhaps other prognosticators, that I think the McCain thing is very real, as Dr. Vinson said. That I've heard that a lot from people. I know that Democrats are hearing it in focus groups. I do think it would be something to watch. It would be very historic. And I mean, Harrison is also trying to, of course, turn out the black voter record levels too, and sort of give black voters an even more of a chance, more of a reason to go to the polls. And if he can sort of get it up to 2008 levels, that's something that could also help him. But if he wins, South Carolina would be the first state in the country to ever have two black senators at the same time, which I think, given that it is the place where the Civil War started and that the Confederate flag was still flying not that many years ago at the state capitol, would be very monumental. I see one question here about the Alaska Senate race. I'll just talk. I wanted to take questions, so I didn't get to some of the other races. So in our lane column, we have Kansas, Alaska, and Texas. I do think Alaska is worth watching. Alaska is one of the hardest races for us to poll. There are a lot of Alaska Native voters, people living in very remote areas that are hard for pollsters to get to. And often we do see sometimes Democratic support overstated in polls. We've seen closer polls there. Democrat Dan Sullivan won a very close race in 2014, ousting Democrat Mark Begich, whose family is legendary in the state. His father had been the at-large representative who died in a plane crash there. And Al Gross is the independent running against him. He's the independent, but it has the Democratic nomination. So again, Republicans are making the argument he's a Democrat. He would caucus with Democrats. Don't be fooled by that. And that could sort of be enough. But Alaska is a pro-choice state. Trump's numbers have gone way down here. They don't like some of his environmental policies. There's just very specific Alaska issues. I watched a debate a few weeks ago there that was all about fisheries. So there are issues that are very germane to Alaska voters that those of us in the lower 48 don't fully understand. Dan Sullivan has a lot of money. He has his own sort of political pedigree. His father had been the Democratic Attorney General under a Republican governor there, Jay Hammond, who helped establish the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is a dividend that's paid out to every Alaskan there based on the oil and gas revenue. So it's certainly one to watch. Again, at this point, I think Sullivan has a lead, but we could very well see surprises on election night.
I'm going to try to tackle two questions at once. We'll see how good I am at combining them. One was a question about whether or not there's any indication Trump's support from evangelicals is slipping, because we have seen a few people come out who are leaders in evangelical circles and endorse Biden. And the other one is, how much effect is the Lincoln Project having? Are these just folks that were already disenchanted with Trump, and so they're giving voice to that group, or is this group actually persuading people? I think in both cases, you're probably seeing those groups move just a small number of them over toward Biden. So the Lincoln Project probably has been persuasive to some who may have voted for Trump reluctantly in 2016, but they have become sort of tired of what they've seen, or they've been unhappy with the pandemic response. Some of those suburban women, for example. And I think that they may move it at the margins in those groups. I think with evangelical voters, again, it's some of the same demographic groups, particularly the college educated women who voted Republican in 2016 because they were concerned about the courts. Now the courts look like they're going to be safe for a little while for them. And so they've got a little bit more license to play around in this election and consider a broader range of issues. And I think in both of those groups, you're not going to see large drops. Suddenly conservatives are not going to go vote for Trump. Evangelicals are still going to support Trump in very high numbers. But I think it's good to remember how small the margins were for Trump winning the election last time around in some of those key states. He didn't win Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania by huge numbers. And so anytime you start getting small shifts in people that should have been considered sort of your safe base, it's cause for concern. And I think that's part of what you're seeing in sort of the electoral college models that Jessica was referring to earlier. That both of those things may only matter at the margins, but in this kind of election, especially in swing states, the margins matter. That's how Hillary Clinton lost those swing states. She lost college educated women, or she lost just enough college educated women that Trump ends up winning in some of those areas.
I see one question here about, being cautious looking at polls, which I talked about a little bit, but I'll just add a few other things. Pollsters really sort of did undergo a big come to Jesus moment, I think, after 2016. And what they determined was that they were sort of undersampling white non-college voters, especially in the Midwest. These are people that are often harder to reach. They have multiple jobs. And that, again, some higher educated people were easier to reach, and those have been oversampled. And so they've adjusted their weighting in polling to make sure that while if they're not getting enough of those voters, they have a representative sample that they can sort of put together a model for. And so I do, and again, the polls in these areas were right in 2018 in some of these congressional races too. So I think that we have more confidence in where the polling is. It's not the same methodology that was used in 2016. Again, pollsters are very cognizant of things that went wrong. I think especially there in the upper Midwest. And then when we look at, for instance, like the Sun Belt races, if anything, I think some of those may be undersampling minority and college educated voters, because for instance, in Arizona, it looked like, that it was going to be a much closer race than it was. And I think that, we see Hispanic voters also sometimes harder to reach if you speak multiple languages or something too. But I do think pollsters have adjusted some of that methodology, and it leaves us a little more confident. But the gold standard for us at the Cook Political Report, I know that there are, testing going on with online methods, and I think some of those can be effective, but we put a much higher weight on live interview polling as well. We also see a lot of internal polling, of course, and some our ratings are also sort of based on those conversations with Republican and Democratic pollsters that we trust. We can't publish all of that, but it of course informs our opinion on where we are putting races and our race ratings as well. And that's for Senate, House, Electoral College as well.
All right, ladies, it is 1 o'clock. So I want to be cognizant of everybody's time and give a fantastic thank you, big Furman thank you to Dr. Vinson and Jessica. It was very enlightening, great information. I appreciate you sharing all that you did with everyone on the call. And want to remind everybody, we've got one more in our business series coming up on December 3rd. It is The Kids Aren't All Right, Growing Up in a Pandemic and What Comes Next. So certainly look for those emails to come out soon for that next business series. And again, thank you ladies so much for being with us. And thank you everybody that's still on the call for being with us, to our Furman friends, family, parents, alumni. We really appreciate you. And make sure you check out our other homecoming activities coming up the rest of this week and next week. With that, I will tell everybody goodbye, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.
Go Paladins.
Go Paladins. That's right. Good ends.
Bye.
Bye.